It's Black Friday, and I'm jumping in on celebrating by offering discounts on 3 of my offerings. The first is the Baby Sleep Roadmap, which is 75% off until December 1st. The second is my Baby Sleep mini course. It's not so mini. It is 50% off. It's self-paced, and you have lifetime access. Lastly, my group coaching program, the Confident and Connected Baby Sleep program, is a 12-plus month group coaching program that gives you online resources, coaching every week, and a community of amazing parents. It is $200 off until December 1st. To explore any or all of these offerings, go to familysleep.ca/Black Friday. That's Black-Friday for all the information.
What I wish everyone knew is that the more we invest in the connection, the easier all of these things actually get, because we're not just wiring our children's brains to behave in a certain way, we are wiring our own brains.
Welcome to the Baby Sleep Connection, a podcast that explores baby sleep and more through the lens of attachment and development. I'm your host, Heather Boyd. I'm a mom of 3, an occupational therapist, and a certified infant and family sleep specialist. If you are a tired parent who wants to support your baby sleep holistically, keep listening as we delve into approaches that go well beyond the usual strategies of wake windows and bedtime routines. Your baby's sleep is connected with so much more. Hello and welcome back to the Baby Sleep Connection podcast. I'm your host, Heather Boyd, and I am pleased to have a guest on today, Sarah R. Moore. She is an author and parenting coach, and I'm actually going to get you to introduce yourself, Sarah, because you have such a beautiful biography of experience, and I think if you frame it, I can always add to it later. So I'm curious for you to share who you are and what is it that you do to serve families.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I adore you and the work that you do, so it is just a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I am Sarah Moore. I do use the middle initial R because, as it turns out, my parents totally lacked creativity when they named me, and I have the same name as a billion other people in the world. So if you Google me, middle initial R for Sarah Moore. Anyway, that aside, I am the founder of Dandelion Seeds Positive Parenting. I am the author of Peaceful Discipline. I am the board chair or president, whatever you want to call it, for the American Society for the Positive Care of Children, which is actually, despite its name, a global nonprofit organization that's consistently ranked as one of the top nonprofits in the world. So I'm very happy about that work as well. I am a certified and accredited parenting coach with an evidence-based and heart-centered parent mentoring program, as well as I'm starting up a brand new, shiny and exciting parent coach certification program as well. But above and beyond all that, I am a real live parent doing this work alongside everybody else. So it's not just the head knowledge, it is the day-to-day. How do I actually apply this stuff that I am very much in with you as well?
Lovely. Well, and I want to add, because I think this is so important for any of the parents that may have little babies and not even have a sense of how is discipline going to look when our kids are 2, 3, 13, 23. And when I look at what makes the biggest difference for my parenting, and I think for a lot of other parents, it's about surrounding ourselves with positive influences and models. And you are one of those people I direct families to for that positive role modeling. And I think the more we see it, it benefits adults just as much as positive role modeling for kids, right? So you are one of those people that I think is such a positive role model for parents that are looking to either strengthen their positive discipline and their positive parenting, or even just to get this introduction to what is this other way that may be very different than their upbringing. So thank you for putting your stuff out in the world, Sarah. I want to ask you to talk a little bit about what it actually means when we use the word discipline, because it's a bit of a garbled word in terms of what we feel like it means. What is discipline?
I am so glad you asked this. This is one of my very favorite questions in the world, because discipline, the word, has been so grossly misrepresented over the past couple of generations that typically when I say, hey, who here likes being disciplined? No hands go up, right? If I go to the gym and I say, I'm here for some discipline, I'm afraid it's really going to hurt by tomorrow. Even as adults, we have this negative connotation with the word. But if we go back to what it's actually supposed to mean, a disciple is a student. To discipline means to teach, not to punish. And that shift in our brains as parents and caregivers is really everything. Because when I think about my favorite teachers I've ever had, be it, bosses I've had as an adult, teachers I had as a kid, other role models, no matter my age, which ones do I gravitate to? The ones who were kind to me, the ones who took the time to really get to know what was going on for me so they could help me and support me in a very personalized way and show up for me with connection and compassion. And above all, these are the people who created enough emotional safety for me that I wanted to learn from them and I wanted to do my very best for them because I valued the relationship so much. So part of the reason I called my book Peaceful Discipline is that it's a reminder that we want to be peaceful so that our kids can and want to learn from us. Also, so that it lands peacefully in their bodies because we know that their perception is their reality. And also, frankly, it's a reminder to our inner child that we always deserved peace and gentleness and compassion, no matter what our actual lived experience may have been. So, long story short, to discipline means to teach, not to punish.
I love that. And I think it can't be spoken about enough because, and I almost am thinking you needed that word at the beginning of the title of your book because discipline would have been misunderstood. It wouldn't have been clear that, well, this is what discipline really is. It's about helping our kiddos know that they are worthy, that we have their back, that we are working to understand them. Maybe we don't always understand them, but we're working to understand them in a compassionate way. When we first did this interview, and we had some tech difficulties, I was just in the middle of listening to the audiobook, which admittedly I accidentally bought instead of the hard copy. And I will say that it was lovely because it allowed me to listen to your voice, which is also very peaceful and very comforting. In that book, you take an approach to learning that is really playful, creative, and really in tune with what engages kids. And it's called story learning. Can you tell us what that entails and what makes it different, perhaps, than other approaches to discipline?
Absolutely. So I do spend probably a good third of the book talking about story teaching, this very concept. And frankly, what it does is it accounts for what we know about child development, what we know about how kids learn, and what we know about what creates memorable experiences, whether our child is teeny tiny or frankly, whether they're all grown up. We all learn through the things that we have a reason to remember. Story teaching engages a part of the brain called the hippocampus. And don't worry, there's no quiz at the end of our podcast about what the part of the brain is called, but it happens to be called the hippocampus, and it is the brain's storyteller. Literally every experience I have ever had, my brain asks the question, should I remember this? Do I need to hold on to this? Or is this something I can let go? And frankly, Heather, it's part of the reason why if somebody asks you or me, all right, 3 Tuesdays ago, what did you have for lunch that day? You're going to go, what kind of question is that? I don't even know what I had for dinner last night, much less lunch 3 weeks ago, unless I am having a meal with George Clooney or some other person who I might go, oh, yeah, that's kind of memorable. I'm not going to have a reason to remember it. So my brain says, I don't need this information. Now let's pretend that I did have a meal with whoever it was. Imagine someone who you think I would sure love to share a meal with that person. That's going to create an emotional memory in my body. I'm going to think about, did I like it? Did I not like it? How did that feel for me? I'm going to hang on to that experience. And that's essentially the role of this part of the brain called the hippocampus. So when it comes to teaching children, we know that just like adults, they have limited capacity for remembering things. So if we want something to be memorable, we have to keep in mind, first of all, to discipline means to teach. So I want to be able to create emotional safety around it. But also, how can I make it emotionally memorable? How can I create an emotional anchor so that this isn't just something they forget about tomorrow or 2 weeks from now? So, for example, I'm going to pause. Would you like an example?
I would love an example.
Okay, great. So let's say that, and I'm just totally doing improv right now. I didn't come with any ready-made in my head. So let's say that, actually, you know what? I'm even going to pause myself for a second and share one other thing about story teaching that is really important for people to know. One of the things I love about it is that you can use it for things that have already happened. So you can use it retroactively, you can use it in the moment, or you can use it for an event that's coming up to help prepare your child to behave or act or in a certain way, or to handle something stressful that's coming up. So I'll take one example that's popping into my mind, and it happens to be something that I really enjoy. It's travel. And especially as we get into travel season, where there are a lot of people doing things that are out of their normal routine. Let's say I have a child who's never been on an airplane before. I have no idea whether they're going to love it or hate it or be somewhere in between about it. So, one of the things that I can start doing, having had plenty of airplane experience in my life, is say, let me tell you what to expect when we get to the airport. Let me tell you what to expect once we're actually in the plane. Let me tell you, and I'm going out of order, let me tell you what going through security is like. But my job is not to negatively bias the child if I, for example, don't enjoy airport security. But let me say that my job is to share a neutral enough experience that I make room for my child to experience it in whatever authentic way they experience it, while also preparing them for the pros and cons of what can happen. Now, again, I want to be careful not to scare a child or good luck getting to the airport that morning, but I can say things like, when we get to airport security, we're going to have to put our bags on the conveyor belt. We'll have to take off our jackets. Depending on our security clearance level, we may or may not have to take off our shoes. And we're going to have to walk through this metal detector thing, and it might beep. And that might mean that somebody's going to pull us over and do the wand thing or whatever. I am not going to continue to go through the whole procedure with you, Heather, because obviously you and everybody else listening is going to know what that's like already. But I want to prepare my child for this. But if I simply share the information, it's only going to help to a certain point. What's going to be more beneficial in preparing my child for this experience is to say things like, different people feel different things about it. Some people get excited going through airport security because they're excited and hopeful, looking forward to the flight that they're about to get on. So some people have a really positive experience with it. For other people, they can sometimes feel a little bit anxious. It's new. We don't necessarily know whether we're going to be the one to be pulled over or not. And, given the body cavity check or whatever, and by the way, don't say that to children. They don't do body cavity checks. But, for some people, there's some anxiety around it. So I want you to know that no matter what you feel, your experience makes sense. And after the fact, I'm going to be there to talk about it with you and support you and validate however it felt for you. So just in this one example, you can imagine how I not only painted the picture visually for what my child should expect, but I also tied some emotion coaching words onto it so that when my child is in the midst of it, let's say they feel anxious, because that's the scarier one, that's the harder one in this example, the child is less likely to have this massive emotional release in the middle of the conveyor belt, right? And, freak out because they know, oh, mommy or daddy or whoever said I might feel a little bit anxious. This is normal. And if I'm really doing a thorough job of the story teaching, I might give my child some tools. If you start to feel anxious, let's practice. You can tap me on the hand 3 times, and I will know that that's when you need a hug. And you can practice this at home ahead of time to empower your child with everything they might need, give or take a little wiggle room for the unanticipated events that come up. But we really give the child the optimal chance of succeeding through this novel experience without having to have just plain anxiety around it. So that was kind of a long example, but you can think about how that might apply to first day of school, first play date. And by the way, first day of school could be for a high schooler or a university student. Frankly, this stuff never expires. And that's one of the reasons I love it, because it truly is for all ages, save perhaps for babies.
Right. Well, and it's a beautiful example. And I love that it was that detailed because I think, again, memory wise, the hippocampus, anyone hearing that story is going to carry that with them for a very long time and be much more likely to apply it. So I'm glad that you used that example. I'm thinking about so many of the kiddos, the highly sensitive kiddos, which I know you know very well, and how difficult transitions are, like first day of school, or even going to or from the park, or going to bed, or going through morning routines, and how this storytelling can put a different spin on what could be one of the clunkiest or challenging parts of the day, not just for kiddo or baby, but for parents too, right? Especially when we're used to it not going well. Is it too late if it's already kind of scripted out as this pattern of challenge to use story teaching to reframe a situation that's happening a lot?
I love this question too. You are so good, Heather. You are fantastic at the questions you ask. It is never too late because the brain, back to the brain again, the brain is capable of something beautiful and magical called neuroplasticity, which basically means we can form new brain highways, new neural connections that can replace our old beliefs, our old stories. The story that we told ourselves yesterday does not have to be the story we tell ourselves tomorrow. So if I am the parent who is in that situation and I know that my highly sensitive child is really struggling and this particular topic, whatever it might be, has been a battleground and I just dread going into it, this is actually a beautiful opportunity to use our brains and story teaching to our advantage. We can sit down with our child in a totally emotionally neutral time, not right before going out the door, whatever the transition time might be. But I'm thinking a Sunday afternoon, for example, where you're not really doing anything else. And you can sit down and say, hey, I want you to know, first of all, how much I love you and that I'm going to support you no matter what. I also know that we have had some struggles when it comes time to leave or do the thing, whatever the thing may be. And I can see how hard it is for you. And it's hard for me too, because neither one of us wants to feel that level of tension when it's time to do that thing. So I would love it if we could talk through what might make it easier and how I can help you feel so incredibly emotionally supported that you know I am here for you and available to help you no matter what comes up. And we can write a whole new story together about how this can go. And first of all, a lot of kids breathe a huge sigh of relief when we do that because we're naming it. We're naming the difficulty instead of just powering through these really hard situations. So, depending on the age of the child, they may or may not have many suggestions to offer. They may or may not offer suggestions that are reasonable or feasible. For example, well, I just won't go to school anymore if the child has to go to school for some reason. Or just give me 45 tons of chocolate and maybe we'll have a deal, mama, right? There are things that we just can't do. But our job as a parent here is not to invalidate what our child is suggesting. That actually will backfire on us if we open the door for brainstorming and collaboration. But then the minute our child shares an idea, we say, well, we can't do that, and here's why. So instead, a much healthier approach is to actually go with the validation of the desire and wherever you can, agreement with the idea, even if execution is impossible. So, for example, I hear you, sweetheart. I understand how much it would be nice if you didn't have to go to school. Yeah, 45 tons of chocolate would be amazing. Where do you think we'd put it all? Well, I'm thinking half of it would go in my tummy in the first 10 minutes, right? We can have these conversations where we validate that what the child's saying is a really fun idea, period. We don't even have to get into the here's why we can't do that. Again, totally knocking out the collaborative piece of what we're trying to accomplish. But when we use story teaching to try to paint the picture of how we want tomorrow to go, we can say, yes, that chocolate would be amazing. Yes, not going to school would be amazing. But here's what we can add. Even if, presuming we do have to go to school tomorrow, let's come up with something we can do immediately after school tomorrow so that we both have something to really look forward together as part of reconnecting. And we talk through what that's going to look like so that the child has that visualization once again. And then once again, we bring in those emotional anchors. That is going to feel so amazing after school when we go to the playground, we go to the park, we go to the movie, we come home and read together. And I tell you, friends, put it on your calendar. Don't forget that you signed up to do this thing, because the more trust you build that the story you and your child are co-creating together is the story that is actually going to come true, the battle becomes less about getting out the door in the morning, because you can come back tomorrow morning with the validation. Yeah, we talked about it yesterday, and I agree. This is really hard. And I want you to know I love you, and I'm going to support you. And by the way, this is not toxic positivity. This is simply reminding the child. And I am so excited that we have this planned thing after school, because that's what's going to help me get through the hard part, knowing I have something else to look forward to. And that can be a game changer, not only for the actual process. And I'm not going to guarantee getting out the door is going to be any easier tomorrow, but you are rewriting the script in your own brain and in your child's brain, thinking that only this perceived horrible thing is going to happen. End of story, close the book, and I just need to suffer through it. It's amazingly therapeutic, and it's truly never too late.
Love it. Love it. And I think that's reassurance to any of the parents who have older kiddos where they're thinking, I didn't come to the table, the parenting table, with these strategies or this framework or perspective. I'm trying to rewrite the stories that I had in my own childhood, and I feel like I've missed the boat. You have not missed the boat. One thing that's coming up as you talk that I know some parents will be wondering about, especially, well, most parents, I think, those that are being very deliberate about not rewarding and punishing, but are using peaceful and positive discipline. What is the distinction between rewards, the reward of what you're going to do after, versus the connection that you're building to get through a tough time?
Brilliant question. Yes, this one is important to me as well, because you're right. Many of us are trying to move away from rewards and punishments. A reward in this example, just to continue what we were talking about illustratively, a reward would be if you make it out the door without crying tomorrow morning or without giving me a hard time or whatever the situation is, then we get to go out for ice cream tomorrow. And then as we're facing that situation tomorrow morning, we are still hanging it over their head like a carrot. Remember, well, carrot, ice cream, totally different, whatever. But hanging it over their head like an ice cream cone, I'll call it that, and say, if you behave right now, oh, stop that crying, then you get this thing later. That's a reward. What's interesting about rewards and punishments is that, let's say the child does have, I don't call it a tantrum or a meltdown, I call it an emotional release, because we do want to reframe getting feelings out as healthier than simply stuffing them down. But let's say that my child does start to release their emotions in a way that is contrary to what I was hoping would happen. If later that day I take path A and say, well, remember how you cried this morning? Now we can't go get ice cream. That's a punishment. Likewise, even if I say nothing, even if I say, well, I guess we'll try again another day, the child still perceives it as a punishment because it is a lack of reward. So we really don't want to do this because we're not setting our children up for behaviorism. We actually want the child to feel emotionally safer with the activity as opposed to just stuffing down their emotions. So what can we do to reframe this if we do want to have something to look forward to, like this ice cream after school? We can reframe it as a celebration. And in this example, let's say that the child does start to cry or release those big feelings before school, and they don't do what we asked of them or whatever. But we can say, you know what, we talked about looking forward to the ice cream after school. My vote is let's celebrate that we made it through the day. We got to the point where we got to do this together. And frankly, in this example, it doesn't matter whether the child struggled in the morning or whether the child went happily. The point is that you are celebrating your action plan of following through on creating a positive and meaningful experience together. Is it going to make that release easier tomorrow when it happens again? No, not necessarily, but over time, you are building so much trust and connection with your child that even if they continue to struggle, eventually their brain starts to record a story of, yes, the morning part is hard, and I'm so thankful we have this connection in the afternoon. And if I were a betting woman, which I'm not, but if I were, I would guess that it won't be too terribly long before the child actually does start feeling more peaceful in the morning because they know that their relationship with you is so rock solid that you're a soft place to land. And that connection, it can be so incredibly healing and therapeutic for the morning that it truly does last throughout the 24-hour period. Final thing I'll say about that, for those of us who have done rewards and punishments in the past, it can be a hard habit to break, especially if you have a child who they themselves frame it as a reward or a punishment. It's going to take time. So just practice. And again, I would name the fact, hey, we've done rewards and punishments in the past. I want you to know that I want to move away from that because I value our relationship more than your compliance. And
I love that. The valuing the relationship more than the compliance. The other piece that comes up for me as you work through this example, well, two things. The first is intention matters. So from an outside perspective, if someone were watching, there may be a lot of similarities in scripting this out with a celebration at the end versus a reward, unless you look at the wording, because I do think the wording is your tip off around intention. But the intention really matters. And if your intention is to come at this through connection, through celebration, through moving, you're not trying to leap to the positive outcome, you're moving towards the positive outcome of cooperation or getting through your day or getting through a really challenging time of the day. But the other piece that comes up is not using connection as a reward, which is also, I think, a pattern that so many parents have a hard time staying out of. They're like, okay, I'm not going to use a reward. So it's not going to be the ice cream, but I'm just going to tell them we can't go to the park together. And then you think, oh, oops, that's using connection as the carrot instead of the actual tangible thing. Can you speak about this? Because I know it's a challenge for a lot of parents.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if we were raised this way. Because I totally grew up in the sticker generation. I don't know about you, Heather, but we had stickers, we had, behavior charts. All these things are not new and they are still incredibly prevalent in society. Not to mention, many of us are still parenting from a place of fear. If I don't do this, what's going to happen when my child is in the real world? What's going to happen when they're not necessarily doing something for connection, but somebody's telling them to do something and they just plain have to do it? So we have to keep in mind that when a lot of these reward and punishment concepts, constructs came to be, we didn't know as much as we do now about attachment, about what actually motivates children, about how connection is really the most important thing we can offer to a child to help them grow and thrive in all of their relationships. And what's really interesting is that children who are raised with connection absolutely do learn to navigate the have-tos in life that come from other people. But coming back to the concept of we are their soft place to land, we're the place where they run to rather than run from or hide things from when things are going sideways for them. I can't stress enough the importance of really prioritizing connection above all. And if we start to go into fear mode, just notice it in our body. This comes up so often in the coaching work that I do. When we start to feel our fear or anxiety or our stress coming out with, well, frankly, I'm going to be blunt. I want to make my life easier as a parent too. I just want my kid to get out the door. I just want my kid to get the thing done. I don't want to have to invest all this quote unquote extra time in building connection when I need them to get out the door peacefully tomorrow morning, right? And what we do know about child development is that a single day where we step back into our old ways of parenting is not going to scar the child for life. It's not going to ruin our relationship. There are days where we just have to get things done, and I want to acknowledge that. But if we truly prioritize this connection from a healthy place, knowing that the relationship is kind of like a grade point average, it's how do you do over time as opposed to individual moments, individual days of test scores, if you will. That's really the end goal that we're going for, because that's how our kids are going to remember their relationship with us someday. Heather, did I answer your question?
Absolutely, you did. And I have other thoughts that have come up as you've been talking. And one of them is this idea of the pressure we have sometimes to solve something immediately, whether that is to quote unquote nip it in the bud, or whether it's to get your immediate goal, which is to get your kid in the car in the next 30 seconds. And it can fluster us so much because we have this huge priority that ends up creating fear in us. Our nervous systems are going wild. It's almost like we're treating it like an emergency when it's not, because our nervous systems are looking for the emergency here because our nervous systems are ramped up so high. And I think in those moments when we feel like we have to solve something immediately, aside from safety issues, which are immediate and swift, when it's not a safety issue, it's probably not an emergency. Even if we're behind for catching a flight, there may be a little more urgency there, but it's still not enough to throw everything out to forget about connection. If we start with connection and remind ourselves that first, before we try to problem solve, before we try to think of what is it that we're supposed to do to get out of this mess that we're in at the moment, connect, connect, connect. I feel like if it were like neon lights all over our house to remind us, connect first, the solutions can come later. Even if it's like a minute later, after calming and talking and connecting, then we can get through those sticky moments a little better.
Yes, yes, yes. And one of the most fascinating things to me as a parent, as well as, a coach and a practitioner in this field, is that what I wish everyone knew is that the more we invest in the connection, the easier all of these things actually get, because we're not just wiring our children's brains to behave in a certain way, we are wiring our own brains to behave in a certain way as well. Do I default to yelling and shaming and blaming and rushing and freaking out? Or do I default to connect first, like you said? And the more I practice it, the easier it gets for me. And one of the things I've personally been so incredibly grateful for as a real life parent here is now that connection is usually my default. Note my usually, I'm human too. I absolutely mess this up sometimes. But since connection is usually my default, now when it's time to get out the door or do the thing, whatever it might be, my child says yes. We don't battle. We don't have any sort of nervous system amp up in these situations because we have created so much safety together that parenting is honestly so much easier because our baseline is so solid. And what it actually makes room for is on the days when we're rushing to make that flight, when we're late for the dentist appointment, for whatever it might be. And I say, hey, I'm so sorry to do this to you, but we need to get out the door right this second. Please, within 30 seconds, have your shoes on. We need to be out the door. My child, 9 times out of 10, is like, holy moly, okay, I'm with you. And she's there. So I still have the option to treat those quote unquote emergencies as such. And my child understands this is not normal. This is a time when I do need to jump up and go and do the thing. But it doesn't have to be our regular occurrence of amping up. And, we talk about co-regulation. We also can co-dysregulate as well. But when we have that co-regulation and really continually show up for each other, it makes the emergencies easier, and it also makes the day-to-day stuff easier. So would I do it over again? 100 times.
Lovely. Well, I think it reminds me too the value of appreciating that discipline in the sense that we're defining it here, having it as easy as possible to make life manageable at a time when the world is chaotic, or the pressures on us as an adult are pretty high. The parenting relationship can be a challenge because of that, or just because parenting is hard, period. That when we start with connection, discipline becomes easier, that cooperation, that collaborativeness. And I know you said collaborative and, story teaching, it ramps up as kids get older because they're more part of the solutions. They can be creative. In fact, time and time again, when I've involved my kids in problem solving, the solutions they come up with, and the key is to be open-minded about it. Like you said, you don't shut down the brainstorming. I'm like, gosh, I could never have thought of that solution myself. And this looks like something that could work. And I have buy-in from my kiddo because they were the ones that came up with the idea. And I paused long enough to hear them and to figure out how we're going to move forward. And so I think about that. What comes up for me too is Gordon Neufeld, who talks about this as well. This idea of how do we make discipline easier, not out of fear, not out of trying to control. And I do want to talk to you about control because I think that's a default setting too. In fact, why don't I ask you now with this idea of the struggle we sometimes have in not trying to control the minutia of parenting so that I think, frankly, is out of our own fear of not getting through the day or not getting what we need to get done. How do we press the reset button on trying to control things around parenting and discipline?
Yeah, so our need to control typically comes from one of two places. Either it's the script that we received when we were growing up. Parents control children. Children's job is to be compliant. So we have that narrative in our own brain, and we're simply acting it out because it's what we experienced growing up. Or the other option of where control often comes from is actually a fear of powerlessness. I never felt heard as a child. I never felt like I had a voice. I never felt like I mattered. So now, as an adult, I am hyper vigilant in trying to control, because what it actually does is it creates safety in my body. I know what to expect. Things can be predictable if I'm in control. So whether your control comes from place A or place B, know that you make so much sense. You are not broken. Your body is doing everything it can to keep you safe. So we have this really negative connotation around being a controlling parent. But I'm here to say, give yourself so much grace and self-compassion if you notice this as one of your parenting traits, because your body, like I said, is just trying to be safe and create safety within it in the parenting context now. So knowing where it comes from can help. And healing needs to happen, understandably, from one of two places as well. If it is our parenting script because it's what we grew up with, we get to get curious about, how did that feel for me when I was a kid? How do I want my child to feel? Do I want my child to be able to self-advocate? Because the tough reality is that we are our children's best place to practice self-advocacy. So if a child, let's say, talks back to me, for example, I can either get upset about it and say, don't you dare speak to me that way, or I can take a more expansive perspective and say, what a gift that my child feels confident enough in their voice that they know when to stand up for themselves. And this is going to be a direct life skill that they can apply on the playground, in friendships, in romantic relationships, someday in the workforce. What a gift. So I get to reframe in my own head what it actually looks like and the benefits of a child having a say in their own life. Now, let's say that my need to control is coming from feeling like I don't have a voice still today. Nobody listens unless I yell, or whatever the case may be. I am going to strongly recommend a book to you called Nonviolent Communication by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg. It is a beautiful pathway, and I work with a lot of parents on finding their own voice, on figuring out what you are feeling and what you are needing, and finding healthier ways to express your needs to your family so that they know what you're actually asking for. But frankly, we as parents are often so giving that we forget that we actually do need to self-advocate too. So once we sort of get our sea legs, so to speak, and practice self-advocating in ways that do no harm, our need to control actually comes down, because we have found healthier ways to collaborate and communicate in ways where we can feel heard by those who we care about and we want to have hear us.
Yes, absolutely. And I've read that book, Nonviolent Communication. I've taken a course on it and I highly recommend it as well. The feelings and needs piece, because when we can understand our own feelings and our needs and be working to understand our children's feelings and needs too, those two things fit together. But what you're saying about the idea of self-advocacy dovetails really well with the next question I had wanted to ask you perfectly, is around boundaries. Because again, I think boundaries, similar to discipline, is a word that we often misconstrue. I wonder if you can speak on this idea of boundaries. What are they and how do we establish them, and what's their purpose? What's the purpose of having a boundary?
Yeah, people do absolutely misconstrue the word boundaries as well. We tend to think of boundaries as rules that we create for other people. And that's actually not true. A boundary is something that I create for myself in order to get my needs met. So let me give an example of this in parenting. Let's say that I'll do a little kid example. Let's say that I have a couple of kids, and the older child is jealous of the baby. And next thing you know, the older child is flinging toys straight at the baby's head, right? This is a high stress situation where it's really easy to go into control mode and freak out mode and all the things, and that completely makes sense. So many people will say that kid needs some boundaries. And what that often looks like in parenting is, you are not allowed to touch the baby that way, and here is your punishment that I'm going to dole out so that you can, quote unquote, learn what you need to do instead. Doesn't actually work that way. So the boundary in this case needs to be, how am I feeling? I'm going to go back a little bit to the Rosenberg stuff. How am I feeling? I'm feeling stressed. I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling fearful because I'm worried about the baby. I'm feeling also fearful because I don't want my older child to turn into someone who harms other people, and I project later in life, how are they going to manage this, whatever. So much going on in my nervous system as I see this situation taking place. Obviously, in the midst of the throwing activities, I'm not going to go in the other room and journal about how I'm feeling. I do need to intervene and block the baby's head, right? So reality, you're not necessarily doing all of this work in the moment, but pausing and saying, I am feeling all of these things. If I look at my feelings list, you know what I have a need for? I have a need for safety in my home. I have a need for gentleness in my home. These are values that I have that I want to make sure that I can teach. These are values that it's important for us all to have if we are going to cohabitate peacefully without taking out a baby's, eye or something, right? So, and sorry, that was a graphic example, did not mean to get it like that. But anyway, so reframing the boundary as far as I have a need for safety, I can actually approach the child not in the midst of the situation, probably. Here, I just need to put a stop to the damage that's being done. But I can say, hey, I have a need to feel safe, and I feel unsafe when anybody in my home is potentially being harmed. So let's work together to talk about how you're feeling, what you're needing, what's going on for you. Frankly, most little kids aren't going to be able to articulate all of this because we have to keep in mind from a brain development point of view, they're impulse driven. And they will continue to be primarily impulse driven until they're 25 to 30 years old, right? So we have to keep child development in mind. But when we are outside of the moment, when we are in a peaceful, neutral zone, we can talk about, hey, I noticed that you were throwing some things at the baby earlier today or yesterday, whenever it was. I imagine you must have had some big feelings in your body when that was going on. And that makes sense. I want you to know everybody gets angry sometimes. Everybody gets frustrated with their siblings sometimes. You make perfect sense to me, sweetheart, and I get it. We do need to also make sure the baby stays safe. So once again, let's figure out some things you can do when you're feeling super angry, because I don't want you to stop being angry sometimes. It's a healthy emotion. It's actually here to help us. But let's figure out what you can do so that we can keep the baby safe and you can get your big feelings out. And then you work with this child on some things they can do. Tomorrow, when the toys start flying at the baby's head again, you can say, hey, remember yesterday, we're going to do this instead. And you can redirect this child and help build that muscle memory, because we talked about neuroplasticity, building those new pathways in the brain. It's going to take time and practice for the child to learn new, healthier patterns. But the point is, when we go in punitively as big and scary parent, the child actually doesn't develop any better coping skills. So long example, once again, but coming back to your question about what is a boundary is something that I'm doing for myself. It's not an arbitrary rule that I'm creating for somebody else. It is based on my feelings, needs, and values so that we can all cohabitate peacefully together.
Well, and that comes beautifully back to one of the ideas you expressed early on about story teaching, which is that sometimes it's about the future. So present, past, or future. And when you're trying to lay out a different path, a different script that's going to happen, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, it might take a while. It's going to take practice, like you suggest, but to be able to script that out or story tell it out, what an alternative would be, what it would look like, and it starts to lay down that story for them. I think that's terrific. I love that example. I want to ask you, as we draw to a close, whether there's anything that is not being talked about in general around peaceful discipline that you wish were more in the forefront of the conversation.
Yeah, oh gosh, top 50 things that come to mind. I would say two sides of the same coin. One is how legitimately hard it can be to get started this way if it wasn't either what we experienced growing up or what we have been doing all along in our parenting, if this is not how we started out. So it's legitimately hard, and I want parents to know Your history does not have to be your destiny. You can absolutely repair. You can absolutely heal this. And the flip side of that coin is that you get to release that guilt, that shame that you've been carrying around not parenting this way or not having experienced this. And frankly, you might even have some resentment toward your own parents or caregivers. All of this needs to be on the table, talked about this. But the other side that I wish people talked about more is that when we do start to parent this way, from connection, from peace, from, curiosity, and with a more abundant mindset, number one, parenting gets easier in the moment, but we also go to bed at night feeling better about ourselves. Our mental health as parents can actually improve because we're not carrying so much emotional weight around all the time. Not to mention, we create this beautiful ripple effect in the lives around us. And when we do this work of healing, albeit imperfectly, none of us does this perfectly, but when we do this work of healing, people really do pay attention. And we know, for example, that the Surgeon General just released this really awful sounding report about how hard parenting is. And I'm here to tell you, yes, that's true. And it absolutely doesn't have to be this way, because I did read that report. I did listen to what was being said about it. And I can say that I know so many parents who have turned things around, and they now legitimately feel joy with their families. They feel connection. They are healing their inner child as well as their outer family, if you will. And when we do these things, it all gets so much easier. And that Surgeon General report can be around people who haven't yet done this work. But once we do, I promise incredible healing on more levels that you can possibly imagine are absolutely within reach for you.
Love it. And I think what I want to draw to a close for this interview is to emphasize again the importance of having mentors and those who are practicing what they preach, who are sharing these concepts around peaceful discipline. Because the more we see it, the more we can rewrite that script or story teach ourselves to be able to parent a different way. So again, I am so grateful that you are in this space, because I think this is such an important thing for parents to be able to see and hear and start to live. So thank you for what you do, Sarah.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for what you do as well. I really appreciate that you start parents out on the right foot, because you're just a gift in this space.
Well, and likewise, I wonder if you could share where people can find you if they're interested in learning more.
Absolutely. So my website is dandelionseeds.com. There is a hyphen in there. It's dandelion-seeds.com. If you squish it all together, you'll get the actual plants, dandelions. I don't sell those. So dandelion-seeds.com. And there you will find my mini courses, my coaching, my certification program, all sorts of free resources that I offer on a regular basis. And perk for everybody, sign up for the mailing list. I hardly ever use it, so you will not get an email from me just because it's Tuesday. I will only share things when it's actually going to be supportive of you. My book is Peaceful Discipline. You can find that basically anywhere. And on the socials, I am Sarah R. Moore, either Dandelion Seeds Positive Parenting, or on Instagram, Dandelion Seeds Positive Living, because the word parenting wouldn't fit. Go figure.
Go figure. Go figure. Well, thank you again, Sarah, for your time. I so appreciate the work that you do and the time that you gave today to share these ideas. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you, Heather.
Bye for now. Thank you for joining me on this episode. I do hope that you found the information and perspectives in this podcast episode helpful to you as you navigate your baby's sleep development. Of course, this podcast provides general information, and it isn't tailored to your family's reality or the specific needs of your baby. If you're concerned about your baby's sleep or health, be sure to reach out to your healthcare provider. If you're feeling exhausted and overwhelmed and you need a place to feel nurtured and reassured, you can find me on Instagram at familysleep.ca. Until next episode, look for the connections that support you and your baby.